What if you walk into your matrimonial bedroom and find your wife giving oral sex to your brother? Imagine trusting the people closest to you, your wife, your children, your own flesh and blood, only to have that trust shattered in the most devastating way possible. How far would you go if you discovered a betrayal that tore apart everything you believed in? You certainly wouldn't. Stay tuned for a potentially dramatic true crime spoof movie. You are not alone. Meet Ethan Miller, the 45-year-old sheriff in Bristol, a man who seemed to have it all. A respected figure in his community, Ethan worked tirelessly to protect and serve, believing in justice, family, and loyalty above all else. He had a loving wife, Carla, and 4 beautiful children, Liam, 15, Ava, 12, Noah, 10, and Emma, 6. On the outside, Ethan's life looked perfect, an ideal family, a prestigious career, and a home filled with love. But beneath the surface, a dark secret was brewing. The very foundation of Ethan's world, trust and loyalty, was about to crumble, setting the stage for a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Stay tuned and be sure to like and subscribe to True Crime Stories to dive deeper into the devastating events that unfolded in Ethan's life, a tale of betrayal, rage, and irreversible consequences. You won't believe what happens next. David Miller, Ethan's younger brother, was everything Ethan was not. While Ethan was steady, responsible, and disciplined, David was impulsive, charming, and carefree. At 42, David had spent most of his life living in his older brother's shadow. Where Ethan had built a career as a respected sheriff in Bristol, David's path had been more erratic, filled with false starts and unfinished ambitions. He had an undeniable charisma that made him the life of any room, able to charm anyone he met with ease. However, beneath that confident exterior was a deep-seated insecurity. David often struggled to live up to the expectations that came with being Ethan's younger brother. Their parents had always favored Ethan's methodical, goal-oriented nature, which left David feeling overlooked and, at times, inadequate. But he wore it well, hiding his jealousy and frustration behind a smile and quick wit. David had always wanted to be the one to make something of himself, but time and again he seemed to fall short. He tried his hand at various jobs, never staying in one place for too long, and found himself in a string of failed relationships that often mirrored the instability in his career. Before Carla, Ethan's wife, entered the picture, David had lived a somewhat aimless life, but that all changed when he met Carla. When David was in high school, Carla had been a quiet and studious girl, a little older than him. Carla's beauty had been more understated back then, but she possessed a warmth that made her unforgettable to those who noticed her. Though they had never been close friends during their high school years, David had always admired her from afar. He could never quite find the courage to approach her, but he remembered her smile, her laugh, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. When Ethan first introduced Carla to his family, it was a moment that would alter the course of everything. Ethan and Carla had met during a community event when Carla was volunteering, and they'd hit it off instantly. Their connection had been magnetic, and within a short time they were inseparable. From the outside, their marriage looked like something straight out of a dream. Carla, a loving wife and mother, fit into the life Ethan had built with ease. But for Carla, the connection she had with David when they first met had always lingered just below the surface, and it would prove to be far more significant than she had ever imagined. As soon as Carla was introduced to David, there was a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't something either of them would admit to at first, but the connection between them was immediate and undeniable. They had known each other in passing, but now there was a different energy between them. Something unspoken, something that neither of them could fully control or ignore. Carla had once been drawn to David's charm during their brief high school interactions, but now, as an adult woman, she saw him differently. David's free-spirited attitude and easy charm were a breath of fresh air compared to Ethan's more reserved, sometimes distant demeanor. Ethan's demanding job as sheriff took up most of his time, and though he was dedicated to his family, the pressures of his career often left little room for emotional intimacy at home. He was a man of duty, a protector of his community, but in his personal life he often neglected the more delicate aspects of emotional connection. He told David that the more delicate aspects of emotional connection. Carla, for all her love and devotion to Ethan, found herself feeling increasingly lonely. Ethan's long hours and constant focus on his work meant that Carla, no matter how supportive or understanding, had to bear much of the emotional load on her own. This created a growing distance between them, one that Carla couldn't shake. They both longed for connection with their kids, and Carla's support was frantically trying to find ways to meet their needs. The quiet moments of solitude became harder to endure, and the love she once felt for her husband started to feel more like a comfortable routine rather than the passionate bond they had once shared. David, however, seemed to notice her in ways that Ethan no longer did. He would often visit, making small talk with Carla, cracking jokes to make her smile, and paying attention to details Ethan had long since overlooked. He noticed when Carla's hair wasn't quite as styled as usual, when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, when she seemed overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood. He saw the woman behind the wife and mother, and that made Carla feel something she hadn't felt in years. Seen, she didn't have to ask for his attention. It came to her naturally. For Carla, this sense of being desired, of being admired for who she truly was intoxicating. At first, Carla tried to brush off these feelings, trying to remind herself that her life with Ethan was the life she had chosen. She had always known that marriage, especially to a man as busy and focused as Ethan, would require sacrifices. But slowly David's presence in their home became more frequent, and with each visit the connection between them deepened. What started as innocent, friendly conversations turned into moments that were far more charged. Lingering touches, quiet smiles, shared memories from high school, and ultimately, stolen glances that neither of them could ignore. As their emotional bond grew stronger, it didn't take long for the affair to begin. It started with a casual meeting here and there, brief encounters after Ethan would leave for a night shift. They had always found reasons to spend more time together, whether it was helping around the house, sharing a glass of wine in the living room, or finding themselves alone in the garage while Ethan worked late. The secrecy was thrilling, the risk only adding fuel to the fire that had already been kindled between them. Brendan smiled at the fire between them. Carla, for her part, justified the affair in her mind. She had never intended for it to happen, never wanted to betray her husband, but David made her feel important, desired, and appreciated in a way that Ethan no longer did. She told herself it was just a phase, that she would put a stop to it. But the more she saw David, the harder it became to break free. In those quiet, stolen moments, it felt like a release, a way of filling the emptiness that had quietly grown between her and Ethan over the years. For David, the affair was not just about fulfilling a desire. It was a twisted way of proving something to himself. He had always lived in Ethan's shadow, overshadowed by his older brother's achievements and stability. David had never felt like he measured up, never felt like he had earned his place. But with Carla, it was different. It wasn't just about wanting her. It was about taking something Ethan had worked hard to build, something David had never been able to have. It was a way of claiming victory, of asserting control in a world that had so often made him feel powerless. With each stolen kiss, each secret moment, David felt like he was finally winning, finally proving to himself that he could be the one to have it all. "Watch," said David. What had begun as a simple connection between two people who once shared a past soon evolved into a deep and secretive affair. Neither Carla nor David could fully acknowledge the depths of what they were doing, but as time passed, the affair became harder to keep hidden. The secrecy, the lies, the constant tension. It was a heavy burden to bear. But for years they managed to keep it hidden, weaving a tangled web of deceit. Carla's world, once built on the foundation of love and trust, now stood on shaky ground, and soon that fragile house of cards would come crashing down. As the years passed, David and Carla's affair became more deeply entrenched in the fabric of their lives. What had begun as a fleeting moment of weakness gradually evolved into something far more complicated, something that neither of them could fully control. They tried to convince themselves it was a temporary escape, that it wasn't what they truly wanted. But deep down, both knew that they were bound together by something stronger than mere attraction. It was no longer just about their physical connection. It was about the power dynamics that had shifted so subtly, but so significantly in their relationship. David's presence in the family home became a normal part of their lives, almost like a fixture in the background. His visits were no longer irregular or brief. He had become a constant presence, one that Ethan trusted implicitly. As the years went by, David would stop by often to help Ethan with small chores around the house, fix things that needed fixing, or simply chat over a beer. To Ethan, it was just brotherly bonding, a way for the two of them to stay close despite their busy lives. But for Carla and David, these family gatherings had become something much more. At first, it was easy to pass off the occasional lingering touch, or the stolen glances across the room as nothing more than an innocent moment. But over time, these moments became more frequent, more intense, and harder to deny. David, with his charm and easy smile, would find ways to get close to Carla during family gatherings. They'd exchange quiet words in a corner of the room, or David would accidentally brush past her in the kitchen. Ethan, too wrapped up in his work, was oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between his wife and brother. It wasn't just during the quiet moments at home that the affair flourished. Every family gathering, every holiday, and every celebration became an opportunity for David and Carla to reconnect in secret. They'd share private jokes and quiet moments while Ethan was distracted, whether it was a quiet conversation in the backyard or a hand brushed against a shoulder during a crowded family dinner. Their connection deepened with each passing day. They were no longer just hiding an affair. They were living in two worlds at once, each increasingly difficult to keep separate. The births of their children, Liam, Ava, and Noah, added another layer of complexity to the affair. With each new arrival, the family's life became even more demanding, and yet David's role in their household continued to grow. As Ethan devoted himself to his duties as sheriff, working long hours and occasionally needing to take calls or leave unexpectedly for urgent matters, David would step in to help. The children, especially Liam, Ava, and Noah, grew fond of their Uncle David. He'd take them fishing, help them with their homework, and be present at their birthdays and school events. His role in the family became more seamless, more integral, until it was nearly impossible to imagine a life without him. Carla couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions as she watched her children grow fond of David. Part of her was proud of how well he had integrated into their family, but another part of her felt a pang of guilt. Ethan trusted David with everything: his family, his children, his home. But deep down, Carla knew that the trust he had in his brother was the very thing that allowed their secret to survive. Ethan's unwavering faith in his brother, his blind trust, made it all too easy for Carla and David to continue their affair without suspicion. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one with far-reaching consequences. Every shared glance, every whispered conversation, every touch that lasted just a fraction too long, it was all a part of the complex web they had woven, one that neither of them could fully untangle. They both knew they were on borrowed time. It was only a matter of time before Ethan began to notice the tension, the distance between him and Carla, the subtle changes in her demeanor. But for now, the affair thrived under the guise of normalcy and tried to ingratiate herself with whatever current emotional bonds they shared with no one else. She would gaze at Ethan and their children, feeling a twinge of love for the life they had built together, and yet there was always a part of her that couldn't shake the pull she felt toward David. The affair was a paradox. It gave her something she couldn't find with Ethan, but it also made her feel more isolated, more disconnected from the man she had once loved. Still, she kept hoping he would come back to her life. It gave her something she couldn't find with Ethan, but it also made her feel more isolated, more disconnected from the man she had once loved. The love she still held toward David, but it also made her feel more isolated, more disconnected from the man. With every passing day, Carla became more convinced that her secret would eventually destroy everything she had worked for, and yet she couldn't find the strength to end it. For David, the affair had taken on a deeper significance. It was no longer just about getting back at Ethan or satisfying his own selfish desires. It had become a twisted form of validation. With each passing year, the affair solidified his place in the family, albeit in a role he could never fully embrace in the light of day. He knew, deep down, that he could never have Carla. Not truly. She was Ethan's wife, the mother of his children, and the woman who held the family together. Ethan's eyes followed Catherine to the boys' room, where she sat with Peter, staring at him. But in those stolen moments, in the secret spaces where no one else could see, he could have her. And that, in his mind, was enough, at least for now. Despite the guilt and the weight of their actions, neither David nor Carla could find the strength to break free from the affair. The secret had become too embedded in their lives, and the consequences of ending it seemed too daunting. They both knew that what they were doing was wrong, but in those quiet, stolen moments, it felt like they were finally living a truth that had been buried beneath years of routine and silence. They suspected that whatever they had done had led them away from the truth in silence. The more they tried to deny it, the stronger the pull between them became. As the years wore on, the tension between David and Carla grew even more palpable. Every time Ethan would leave for work, every time the children would go to bed, they were reminded of their deep and secret bond. The affair had woven its way into the very fabric of their existence. They were no longer just hiding a physical relationship. They were living a lie, one that was slowly suffocating the very thing that had once held them together. Trust. Trust. Sitting there in the dark, they reflected on the past year that they had spent in triumph. But in the back of their minds, both knew that this dangerous game couldn't last forever. Ethan's trust in them, in their family dynamic, had created a fragile illusion of normalcy. But nothing lasts forever, and the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. Ethan had to confront reality. The truth of their family's history had been revealed. The question was no longer if the truth would come out, it was when. The shift began slowly, insidiously, almost imperceptibly. Ethan had always prided himself on being a man who could trust those closest to him. His job as sheriff required him to read people, to understand when something wasn't quite right. But in his own life, he had always assumed that the bonds of family were built on honesty and loyalty. He had never questioned Carla or David. After all, David was his brother, the man who had stood by him through thick and thin, and Carla, his wife, the mother of his children, was the heart of their home. Nothing, in Ethan's mind, could shatter the sense of security he had worked so hard to build. But that sense of security, that unshakable confidence in the truth of his family's relationships, began to fray. It started with a casual remark from Carla. They were having dinner, one of those rare family moments when all four children were gathered around the table, laughing and bickering over what to watch on TV. Liam, their oldest, was sitting across from his mother, a slight frown on his face as he picked at his food. Carla had been talking about how much Liam had grown lately, marveling at how quickly he was becoming a young man, and then, almost as an afterthought, she said something that would alter the course of everything. "You know, it's funny. Liam really does look a lot like David, don't you think?" "I love it." The words hung in the air for a beat longer than necessary. Ethan's fork, halfway to his mouth, paused. He blinked and looked up at Carla, then across the table at Liam, who, at that moment, was laughing at something Emma had said. Ethan felt a strange, uneasy stir in his chest. It was the way Mary had once said that Mary could smell the fear. Ellie held her temper. David had always been a handsome man, charismatic and easygoing, but the resemblance to Liam? That was something different. Liam had the same dark hair, the same lean build, and even the same intensity in his eyes. But Ethan had never really thought much of it. He'd just assumed his son had inherited these traits from him. The thought that Liam might resemble David in ways that felt almost too exact unsettled him. Carla, oblivious to the storm she had just sparked, continued talking about how their son was growing up so fast, how he was becoming so independent. But Ethan was no longer listening. His mind was racing. For a few minutes he tried to shake off the feeling that was starting to take root in his mind. It was a simple comment, nothing more. But why had Carla mentioned it? Why now? It wasn't like her to bring up David so casually. There had been a time when they barely spoke of him unless it was necessary, a time when everything about their lives was just as it should be. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself increasingly preoccupied with the thought. He would replay the dinner conversation in his head, trying to make sense of it. Could Carla have meant something by it? Was it possible that she was drawing attention to something that had been gnawing at her for years? Or was it just an innocent remark? But that thought, that gnawing feeling, wouldn't leave him. The more Ethan tried to push it away, the more it lingered, festering in the back of his mind. Every time Liam smiled, every time he spoke, Ethan couldn't help but notice the subtle ways in which he resembled David. He couldn't deny it. There was a certain look in his son's eyes that mirrored his brother's, a certain ease in the way Liam carried himself that was strikingly similar to David's casual confidence. Carla's comment now felt less like a passing remark and more like a breadcrumb left behind in a trail he couldn't ignore. Strangely, there was a softness in her voice now, too. Days turned into weeks, and the unease grew into suspicion. Ethan found himself studying Liam more closely, trying to trace the features of his own family in his son's face. But instead of seeing pieces of himself and Liam's smile, all he could see was his brother's image reflected back at him. The more he looked, the more unsettling the resemblance became. At last, his grandfather glanced up from a hard journal and rose to his feet, and began reading a few pages from the journal. That's when the doubt started to settle in. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let suspicion consume him. He was a man of facts, of evidence, of clear-cut truths. But now, everything seemed clouded. Could it be possible? Could Liam, his son, the child he had raised, actually be David's? Ethan's mind raced as he tried to push the thought away, but there was a small part of him that couldn't ignore it. David's charm, his ease with people, his similar mannerisms, had they been passed down to Liam in a way that defied logic? Or had he been blind all these years, unable to see what was right in front of him? The more Ethan thought about it, the more the question gnawed at him, and with it came another uncomfortable thought. If Liam wasn't really his son, if there was even the smallest chance that he wasn't. What did that mean for everything he had built? What did it mean for his marriage to Carla, for the life they had all built together? Unable to let go of the growing anxiety, Ethan made a decision, one that would change everything. He couldn't do this on suspicion alone. He needed proof. But proof could only come in one form: a DNA test. The idea of it filled him with dread. He didn't want to doubt his son, didn't want to question the family he had fought so hard to protect. But the whispers of doubt had already taken root, and he needed to know, once and for all, whether Liam was truly his child. He'd heard of people who had gone to extreme lengths to uncover the truth, who had ordered DNA tests to settle family mysteries. But this was different. This wasn't some curiosity about a long-lost relative. This was about his own flesh and blood, his own son. It felt like a betrayal, like he was turning his back on everything that had ever mattered to him. "What happened?" Faulkner asked wearily. "I think so," Devick said. Yet the thought of not knowing, of living with this doubt, was unbearable. Ethan approached the situation cautiously. He didn't want to reveal his suspicions to Carla just yet. He couldn't bear the thought of confronting her with something that might just be his imagination running wild. So he came up with a plausible excuse to order a DNA test: curiosity about medical histories, about genetic traits that might run in the family. It was a harmless reason that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. He had no idea what Lona would think, but her heart was in the right place. It was the perfect cover. He ordered the test, his hands trembling as he filled out the online form. It would take a few weeks to get the results, but those weeks felt like an eternity. The worst part was the waiting, the knowledge that in a matter of days his world might be shattered, that everything he thought he knew about his family might be a lie. But there was no turning back now. He had made the choice, and now he had to face the truth, no matter how it might break him. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Ethan Miller's life. The secrecy, the isolation, the tension. He carried it all with him as he went about his daily duties as sheriff, trying to maintain the composure expected of him. But every time he looked at Liam, Ava, or Noah, the unease gnawed at him. And every time he looked at Emma, the smallest and youngest of his children, it was a reminder of the truth he was desperate to avoid. The waiting felt like an eternity. When the envelope finally arrived, Ethan was alone in the house. Carla had taken the children out to run errands, giving him the rare moment of solitude he had been craving, though it was the last thing he truly wanted. His hands trembled as he slid open the envelope, the white paper inside stark and cold. The results were printed in black and white, a list of names, percentages, and cold facts. The first name on the list was Liam, his son. The boy who had grown up under his roof, who had shared his life and his name. The line next to Liam's name read, 0% biological relationship. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The next name was Ava. He stared at the screen, his eyes blurry as he read the results. Again, the same stark truth. 0% biological relationship. His heart raced. Then Noah. 0% biological relationship. It felt like the world was falling apart, his children, his family, everything he thought he knew. The room around him spun as if he were standing in the middle of a storm, caught in the eye of a hurricane, unable to grasp hold of anything solid. Ethan's mind was a blur of emotions. Rage, disbelief, heartache, and a deep, profound sense of betrayal. He stumbled back from the table, the paper still clutched tightly in his hands, as though he might tear it apart and make the truth disappear. But it wouldn't go away. No matter how much he wanted to deny it, the results were clear. He had been living a lie. The only one of his children who was truly his was Emma, the youngest, the smallest, the one who still clung to him at night, who still called him Daddy with the innocent love only a child could give. The discovery shattered him. Ethan thought of all the years he had spent raising Liam, Ava, and Noah. Their birthdays, their school recitals, their scraped knees, their laughter echoing through the house. He had poured his heart and soul into them, thinking they were his flesh and blood. But now, the foundation of his entire life felt like it was crumbling beneath him. A whirlwind of thoughts spiraled in his head. How long had Carla and David been lying to him? When had they made the decision to keep the secret? Did David know all along, or had Carla kept him in the dark as well? The questions were endless, each one more painful than the last. The anger came next. It burned through him like wildfire, hot and uncontrollable. How could Carla do this to him? How could she betray him, betray their family, in such a profound way? And David, his own brother, the man he had trusted with everything, who had stood by him through thick and thin. Had he been part of this all along? Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of chaos as he paced the kitchen, the DNA results still in his hand, burning into his skin. The truth was here, and he could not escape it. His family had deceived him, lied to him, and now everything was shattered. Patrick closed his eyes. But he couldn't let this happen in silence. The storm inside him would not be contained. He had to confront them. He had to know why. The sound of the front door opening interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Carla and the kids were home. For a moment, Ethan considered confronting her immediately, throwing the DNA results in her face, demanding the truth. But then a deeper, more vengeful part of him took over. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. He wasn't going to let her hide behind excuses or apologies. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He made his way to the living room, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt cold and alien to him. He heard Carla's voice as she entered the house, followed by the excited chatter of the kids. It was all so normal, so painfully ordinary, and yet everything had changed. He finally let himself into the house, ready to face the day ahead with trepidation and hope. Ethan stood there for a moment, just watching them. Carla appeared first, her face lighting up when she saw him, but the warmth in her expression faltered when she saw the look on his face, an expression of devastation, of raw pain, of a man who had just learned the most unbearable truth. "Ethan, what's wrong?" Her voice trembled, but Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were locked on her, burning with fury and confusion. He held up the envelope. "The DNA results." "I know," he said, his voice low but heavy with rage. "I know everything, Carla." For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The kids, sensing the tension, grew quiet, looking up at their parents, confused. Carla's face paled. She swallowed hard. "What do you mean, Ethan?" Ethan's hands shook as he dropped the envelope onto the coffee table, pushing it toward her. "This means, Carla, I know that Liam, Ava, and Noah are not my children, that they're not mine, not biologically, and I know who they belong to. I know the truth." Carla gasped, her eyes widening in shock, but there was no denying the pain in her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked over at David, who had just stepped into the room, his face drawn tight with guilt. "How are you doing?" he said. Carolyn gave him a skeptical look. Ethan's gaze flicked to David, and the weight of betrayal hit him like a physical blow. He had always trusted his brother, trusted him to be loyal, to stand by him no matter what. But now, That trust was nothing more than ashes. "How long, Carla?" Ethan's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "How long have you been lying to me? Was this all just a game to you? To both of you?" David stepped forward, his face tense. "Ethan, I never meant for it to happen this way. We didn't—" "You didn't mean for it to happen," Ethan interrupted, his anger bubbling over. "You think that makes this okay? You think this is something I can just forgive, that I can move past?" The tears were streaming down Carla's face now, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the gut-wrenching discovery that tore his world apart. "I didn't want this, Ethan," Carla whispered, choking on her tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, but you did," Ethan spat, his voice trembling with both rage and heartbreak. "You hurt me. You hurt all of us, and now everything is ruined, everything." The weight of the words hung in the air, suffocating. In that moment, Ethan knew there was no going back. The truth had come to light, and there was no undoing the damage. The revelation had shattered their lives in ways they could never repair. He turned toward Ethan and whispered, "What if I never told you things?" His voice trailed off, in hesitance. The anger inside Ethan Miller felt like a live wire sparking through his veins, threatening to break free at any moment. The confrontation with Carla and David had been brutal, but it was only the beginning. The weight of the truth, of his family's betrayal, hung over him like a dark cloud, smothering him with an overwhelming need for retribution. Together, in a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal, he had to do something. He had to confront them, make them pay for what they had done to him, to his family. The thought consumed him completely, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the world outside of his anger didn't even exist. He couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the image of David and Carla in his mind became clear. It wasn't enough that his wife and brother had stolen years of his life. No, it was worse. It was the shameful, selfish way they had carried on in his very home, in the place where his children had laughed, where he had believed in their loyalty. They had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. He decided once more that he must find Dinah and stay some time with her. He would fain carry her off to France. He dared not sleep. Without another thought, Ethan turned, storming up the stairs of the house toward their bedroom. His footsteps echoed in the quiet, and with each step, his mind raced. He could still hear David's words, his insincere apologies, but they meant nothing now. Nothing would ever mean anything again. Ethan had lived a lie for so long, and now he had no choice but to destroy the lie, no matter what it cost. He reached the bedroom door. The sound of muffled voices came through, low and secretive, almost as if the very act of betrayal was still happening behind that door. Carla's soft laugh, David's hushed tones. They thought they were safe. They thought they could keep hiding. But they were wrong. Ethan swung the door open with a violent force, the wood slamming against the wall. Carla and David froze. Carla, dressed only in a silk robe, looked up in shock, her face immediately falling as she recognized the fury in his eyes. David, sitting up on the bed, his expression shifting from surprise to fear, knew instantly that the game was over. There was no more hiding, no more pretending that everything was fine. Carla and David swung around, raising their weapons. Ethan's eyes locked onto David first, his brother, the man who had been the closest person in his life for decades, the brother he had trusted more than anyone. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The betrayal burned through him like a furnace, igniting every part of him in a white-hot fury. He had spent years protecting David, even when others had questioned him, even when the whispers had started. Ethan had stood by his brother, and now his brother had destroyed him, destroyed everything Ethan had worked for, destroyed their family. The weight of the betrayal pressed on Ethan's chest, suffocating him. His breath quickened, and his hand instinctively reached for his holstered weapon, a familiar comfort amidst the chaos that was threatening to consume him. David made a move as if to speak, perhaps to apologize, but there was no more time for words. Ethan was beyond reason now. The rage had taken over, the overwhelming need to stop the pain, to stop the betrayal, pushing him to the brink. Without thinking, without hesitation, Ethan drew his service weapon. The gunshot rang out, deafening in the small, confined space of the bedroom. David never had a chance. He didn't even see the shot coming. The bullet struck him square in the chest, tearing through his body with the force of Ethan's fury. The blood splattered across the white sheets, a stark, shocking contrast to the soft luxury of their affair. David's body went limp as he fell back onto the bed, his eyes wide, mouth agape in an expression of utter disbelief. The gunshot reverberated in Ethan's ears, but there was no satisfaction, no relief. There was only emptiness. The noise in his head refused to fade, but it was different now, quieter, almost drowned out by the ringing in his ears and the absolute stillness of the moment. He had done it. He had made his brother pay. But the pain, the agony that had brought him to this point, was still there, a deep ache in his chest that couldn't be erased by violence. His gaze lowered to the blood on the floor. Carla screamed, rushing to David's side, her hands reaching for him as if to pull him back from the brink of death. Her voice cracked as she shouted his name, the sound raw, desperate. But Ethan wasn't listening to her anymore. Her cries were like the whimpers of an animal caught in its own trap. "Ethan, no, please," Carla gasped, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up at him, pleading, "You don't understand. I never meant for it to happen like this. Please, don't." But Ethan wasn't listening. His hand, still trembling from the shot, raised the gun again. His eyes didn't waver from Carla's face. The betrayal was the same. The hurt, the lies, the broken trust. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. She, too, had to pay. Carla tried to shield herself with her arms, instinctively curling into a defensive position. But it was futile. Ethan was beyond the point of mercy now. The weapon fired again. The second shot hit her in the chest, and she crumpled onto the floor beside the bed, her body spasming for just a moment before she fell still. The silence after the shots was suffocating, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The love Ethan once felt for Carla, the affection, the trust, had been destroyed in an instant. The woman who had once been his partner, his equal, had now become just another casualty in a moment of blind vengeance. "No," he said. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving as if he were trying to breathe through a vice. The gun was still in his hand, and the weight of it, the cold metal, felt like a shackle, binding him to the violence he had just unleashed. For a long moment, the room remained eerily silent. Ethan stared down at the bodies of the two people he had once trusted more than anything in the world. His brother, his wife. Natalie peered down at the wounded men and knew that she had chosen safety. But there was no going back now. The damage had been done. The silence that followed the gunshots was thick and suffocating, hanging heavy in the air like an unbearable weight. For a brief moment, Ethan felt detached from the chaos he had just caused, as though he were floating above the scene, disconnected from the horrifying reality of his actions. His mind was a swirl of confusion, anger, and regret, but the shock hadn't quite set in. "I distracted myself," he said. That was until the sound of footsteps reached his ears. Liam, his eldest son, was the first to react. He had been sitting downstairs, his eyes glued to his phone, lost in a world of adolescence and preoccupations. But the distant gunshots had pierced through his distracted thoughts, and a cold, unsettling dread gripped him in an instant. It wasn't just the gunfire that sent him running toward the stairs. It was the gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. Krell. Liam shot up from his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath was shallow as he bolted toward the stairs, calling out, "Mom? Dad?" A sickeningly tight knot formed in his stomach as he reached the top of the stairs, his feet quickening as he neared the bedroom. The door was ajar, a crack of darkness on the other side, and the sight that met his eyes froze him in place. His Uncle David, his beloved uncle, was sprawled across the bed, blood soaking through the sheets, and Carla, his mother, lay motionless on the floor beside him. The sight was beyond comprehension. The room was still, the sharp metallic scent of blood mixing with the heavy, stale air, as if the life had been sucked out of the house entirely. "Mom, Uncle David?" Liam whispered, his voice shaking, his body frozen in place, unable to process the horror in front of him. Just behind him, his siblings, Ava, Noah, and little Emma, emerged from the stairs, their faces confused, panic rising in their eyes as they saw the sight Liam had already witnessed. The children were silent, their wide eyes full of fear as they slowly stepped forward. They didn't yet understand what they were seeing, but they felt it. They felt the fear and confusion that swirled around them like an unshakable storm. Ethan's voice broke through the room, low and steady, though his words were heavy with a cold finality. "Get back! Stay where you are!" Liam snapped his head around, the force of his father's voice like a slap to the face, sending him stumbling backward, his heart hammering harder than before. His voice cracked as he called out, "Dad, what happened? What's going on?" The father they had once known, the strong, reliable man who had always been their protector, was no longer there. The voice that answered them now was unrecognizable, guttural, as if it came from someone far removed from the man who had raised them. Ethan's eyes were dark, clouded with something far worse than confusion. Guilt, shame, and the undeniable horror of what he had just done. He took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady himself, but the weight of the moment crushed him from all sides. "Go downstairs," Ethan ordered, his voice cracking with a mix of anguish and authority. "I need you to stay there. Do it now." There was no defiance in Liam's response, only fear. His hands trembled as he reached for his younger siblings, ushering them away with shaky, unsteady hands. The world seemed to fall away around him as they retreated back down the stairs, their wide eyes glued to their father, as they left the nightmare behind them. But Liam couldn't tear his mind away from the room above, the image of his mother and uncle, their bodies so still, so lifeless, kept flashing in his mind like a broken film reel, looping over and over again. What had happened? Was this a dream? It couldn't be real, could it? Below, Ethan moved with robotic precision, his steps heavy, his mind in a fog. He made his way to the living room, dragging his feet as if each step took everything out of him. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had killed the two people he had once loved, his wife, his brother. Ethan reached the phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. His mind was a blur of emotions, disbelief, rage, guilt, confusion. But one thing was certain in his heart. He needed to confess. He needed to admit what he had done, to face whatever consequences lay ahead, because there was no escaping the gravity of his actions. "Come, sit down," he said. "Come sit by me," he thought. He knew what he meant. The operator answered with practiced calm. 911, what's your emergency?" She sighed. I've killed them," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words were still crystal clear. The guilt surged again, choking him. "My wife and my brother. I shot them. I didn't mean to, but I did." The operator was immediately on high alert. "Sir, can you tell me your location? Stay on the line with me. We can help you." plush stretched out across the bed, and the pace began to build slowly, growing less jerky as the time passed. Ethan's breath hitched as he tried to steady himself, but it was too much. His emotions broke free in a cascade of agony, his chest constricting as he struggled to hold back tears. "I'm at home. I can't undo what I've done." The operator tried to calm him, but Ethan barely heard the words. His mind was far beyond the reach of help. His own voice, hoarse and full of regret, filled his ears as he repeated over and over, "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to kill them." He paused a few moments before continuing. "I came here looking for answers. The memories of Q and I were lost." Moments later, the unmistakable wail of sirens echoed from outside. The sound of flashing lights and approaching officers cut through the fog in Ethan's mind, snapping him back to the present. The police were on their way. He could hear their footsteps on the gravel as they approached the front door. There was no escape now. When the officers arrived, they found Ethan sitting alone in the living room, the gun still in his hand, but lowered. His face was pale, his eyes empty, as if he had lost everything in the span of a few minutes. He didn't fight back as the officers moved toward him, their voices sharp with commands. When the officers reached him, Ethan lifted his eyes and reached out with his left hand to the girls in the wheelchair. They reached out with their right, put the weapon down, step away from the gun. Ethan obeyed, his hands shaking as he let the weapon fall to the floor, its metallic clatter loud in the tense silence. He barely registered the officers as they cuffed him, their hands efficient and unfeeling. It was almost as if they were dealing with a different person altogether, someone unrecognizable, someone who had no place in their world. As they led him away, Ethan's mind wandered to the faces of his children, Liam, Ava, Noah, and Emma. He couldn't look them in the eye. He couldn't bear the thought of what they would think of him now. How could they ever forgive him for what he had done? Could they ever look at him the same way again? The questions gnawed at him, but there were no answers, only the hollow emptiness that had consumed him. The weight of his guilt pressed in, unbearable and suffocating, as the world around him became a blur of flashing lights and harsh voices. Ethan Miller, once the pillar of his family, now found himself led away in handcuffs, the man he used to be slipping further and further away with each passing second. His life, once filled with purpose and love, had disintegrated into nothingness, and the weight of his regret would haunt him forever. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air heavy with judgment. The spectators, some familiar with Ethan Miller's career as a well-respected sheriff, others merely curious onlookers, watched as the proceedings unfolded. Behind the glass, reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every detail of the case that had captured national attention. The tragic downfall of a man who had once been a pillar of his community. Ethan sat in the defendant's chair, a shadow of the man he had once been. His face was pale, his eyes hollow with the weight of his guilt. He had never imagined his life would come to this, that his days would be spent in a courtroom, fighting to explain his actions, when he had already condemned himself in his own mind. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Reed, made their case with calculated precision. They painted Ethan as a man who had failed not just as a husband, but as a father and public servant. Ethan Miller, a sheriff entrusted with upholding the law, betrayed everything he stood for when he took the lives of his wife Carla and his brother David, she argued, her voice firm and unforgiving. There can be no justification for the brutal, cold-blooded murder of two people, no matter the emotional pain the defendant claims to have suffered. His position of authority and the years of training should have been enough to control his impulses. Reed laid out the facts, the premeditation involved in the killings, the murder weapon that had been taken from Ethan's own service gear, the lack of remorse shown in the immediate aftermath. This was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. This was a calculated act of vengeance, she declared. And what's worse, his actions were witnessed by his children, who will carry the scars of this day for the rest of their lives. The prosecution also focused on the emotional devastation Ethan had inflicted on his children. The trauma of witnessing the murders combined with the knowledge of the affair and the devastating loss of their mother would leave them broken. The impact on the children was an undeniable part of the case, and Reed argued that Ethan's rage had not only taken 2 lives, but it had irreparably damaged the lives of 4 innocent children. The defense, represented by Charles Hargrove, a seasoned criminal lawyer, attempted to offer a different perspective. Hargrove portrayed Ethan as a man pushed to the edge by years of emotional turmoil and betrayal. "My client is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a man who was destroyed by the woman he loved and the brother he trusted," Hargrove argued. The affair, the deception, the lies, all of this was too much for him to bear, and in that moment, when he learned the truth, he snapped. Hargrove's strategy was to humanize Ethan, to show that his actions, though extreme, were driven by raw emotion. When Ethan shot Carla and David, it was not a decision born of malice, but of anguish. He was a man broken by betrayal, and in his brokenness, he did the unthinkable, Hargrove said. He argued that Ethan's history as a law enforcement officer, someone who had dedicated his life to upholding justice, should not be used against him, but rather understood as a man pushed beyond his breaking point. Yet, despite the defense's arguments, the case was straightforward in its facts. Ethan had killed 2 people in cold blood. His grief was undeniable, but it did not excuse what he had done. The trial stretched on for weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments, calling expert witnesses, and detailing the emotional toll on the Miller family. The courtroom became a battleground of words, where Ethan's past life, his reputation, and his sense of duty collided with the undeniable horror of his actions. Finally, after a long and exhausting deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. The judge's gavel struck with a finality that echoed in Ethan's mind, though he had already resigned himself to his fate. The verdict was clear: guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Carla and David Miller, and guilty of 4 counts of child abuse for the psychological and emotional harm inflicted upon his children. The room held its breath as the judge turned to Ethan. His face remained impassive, the eyes that had once been full of confidence and authority, now vacant, clouded with remorse. "Ethan Miller, you have been convicted of the murder of 2 individuals and the emotional abuse of your children. Given the nature of these crimes and the irreversible damage they have caused, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He had braced himself for this moment, but the finality of it, the absolute inescapable truth, crushed him. He was not surprised. In fact, part of him had been expecting it all along. But that didn't make the sentence any easier to bear. As the court officers led him away, Ethan did not resist. There was no fight left in him, no defiance. The weight of what he had done was far more punishing than any prison sentence could ever be. The faces of his children flashed in his mind. Liam's eyes filled with fear, Ava's confusion, Noah's silent grief, and little Emma, too young to understand but forever scarred by the violence that had erupted in their home. Ethan would never be able to undo the damage he had caused. In the cold, sterile environment of the prison, Ethan became just another inmate, a man who had lost everything. His title as sheriff, his family, his reputation, all had crumbled under the weight of his own choices. Life in prison was a relentless, unyielding existence. Ethan spent his days in isolation, his thoughts a constant loop of regret. He tried to reach out to his children, but his attempts were futile. No letters, no phone calls. Just a silence that spoke volumes. Occasionally his children were brought up in conversation, but Ethan quickly learned that the distance between him and them was unbridgeable. His name, once spoken with respect and admiration in the community, was now a curse, a stain on the Miller family legacy. Years passed, but the anguish never dulled. His mind remained trapped in that moment, the moment of betrayal, rage, and irreversible consequence. Ethan Miller, the sheriff who had once held his family together, was now just a man serving his time, and in the depths of his soul he knew there was no redemption, no way to undo the damage he had wrought. Ethan read the report on the desk in front of his office. Years passed in the confines of prison, but for Ethan Miller, time seemed to move in slow, agonizing waves. Each day was a blur of cold concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and the quiet hum of distant voices. The world beyond those prison gates continued on, unaware of the man who had once been a figure of authority and trust in the small town of Bristol. In the quiet solitude of his cell, Ethan had little to occupy his mind beyond his regrets. The clang of metal doors, the shuffle of feet in the hallway, and the occasional conversation of other inmates were the only sounds that punctuated his long, monotonous days. He spent hours lying on the cot, staring up at the gray ceiling, lost in his thoughts. His days of patrolling the streets of Bristol, of protecting his community, seemed like a distant memory, an image of a man he barely recognized. The years had not softened the sting of his guilt, nor had they dimmed the sharpness of his sorrow. What haunted him most wasn't just the act of murder, the cold and final killing of his wife and brother, but the emotional devastation he had inflicted on his children. Every thought, every moment of clarity, always circled back to them. His heart ached with the knowledge that he had destroyed their innocence, shattered their sense of security, and left them scarred in ways that would never fully heal. End of chapter 13. He imagined them often. Liam, now a young adult, surely a shadow of the boy who once looked to him for guidance. Would Liam ever forgive him? Could he in time come to understand the pain that had driven his father to commit such unspeakable acts? Ava and Noah, how would they carry on, knowing that their mother and uncle had both been taken from them by the man who should have been their protector? And Emma, the youngest, so small when the tragedy had occurred, would she even remember her mother? Would she grow up to know the full extent of what had happened? Or would the story be lost to her, buried under years of silence and trauma? The more Ethan thought about his children, the more the weight of his choices crushed him. His only solace, if it could be called that, was the certainty that he would never see them again. Their faces, frozen in his mind, would remain there, untouched by time. There would be no more birthdays, no more graduations, no more moments of shared laughter or love. He had forfeited that future in an instant, and no amount of time in prison could ever return it to him. "Please be with him," she said with a faint hope for acceptance. When William didn't respond, she exclaimed, horrified by the prospect of his future in an instant. He would be with them during the struggle. One morning, as he sat at the small metal table in his cell, he was handed a letter from his lawyer. It had been years since he had received anything, and he was surprised by the weight of the envelope. It was a letter from his son, Liam. End of chapter 9. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. His heart raced, and for a moment he almost couldn't bring himself to read the words, afraid of what they might say. But curiosity and a desperate need for some form of connection propelled him forward. Bob lifted the screen, dropping it back to his palm. The letter was brief, written in Liam's familiar scrawl, but the words hit Ethan like a physical blow. I don't know what to say to you. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened, or if I ever will. You're my father, but I'm not sure who you are anymore. I hate what you did to Mom, to Uncle David, to us. You destroyed everything, but maybe you didn't know. You didn't know what you were doing. I don't know. I'm confused. I don't want to hate you, but it's hard. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Liam. The letter was a mixture of anger, confusion, and a desperate search for meaning in the wake of destruction. It was the only communication he had received from his children since that fateful day, and it struck him to his core. Liam's words echoed in his mind for hours. The boy, no, the man now, was lost, and Ethan had put him there. Had his rage been justified? Was it an uncontrollable breakdown of emotions, or had he simply let his anger blind him to everything else? In his mind, Ethan replayed the moment again and again. The brutal confrontation, the violence, the irreversible destruction. The memories were sharp and searing, but they were also filled with questions. Was I a victim of my own emotions? Was I so devastated by the betrayal that I lost all sense of reason? Or was I just a man who couldn't control the darkness inside me? A man who let it consume everything I loved? Ethan didn't know the answer. Maybe there was no answer. He couldn't untangle the web of rage, guilt, and regret that had become his life. His mind often wandered to the concept of betrayal, a word that had become his only truth. His wife had betrayed him, his brother had betrayed him, and, in a way, his own emotions had betrayed him. Had his actions been the result of betrayal, or had he, in turn, betrayed himself, his family, and his community by giving in to his darkest impulses? And the question of why lingered in his mind, a question he would never find the answer to. But the most painful realization was the legacy he had left behind. What would he be remembered for? Not as a sheriff, not as a father, not even as a husband. He would be remembered as the man who destroyed his family, who destroyed everything he had worked for, all for the sake of blind rage. XOXO6666, he answered, half imagining. The prison walls felt suffocating as Ethan continued to reflect on his past. He had once been a man of duty, a man of integrity, someone who protected and served. But now he was a hollow shell, a man defined by his failure, his actions. His children would grow up knowing him as a criminal, as a murderer. The father they once looked up to was now a shadow in their lives, a painful reminder of a lost future. Please help out with finding my child. The more Ethan reflected, the more he realized that betrayal was not just something that happened to him. It was something that had always been within him. The rage that had built up over the years, the unresolved pain, had been brewing for a long time. It had been festering quietly, only waiting for the right moment to explode. And in that moment, when he confronted Carla and David, he had become a prisoner of his own fury. Perhaps the greatest betrayal of all was the one he had done to himself. He had let his emotions destroy everything he had ever loved, everything that had ever mattered. His career, his family, his future, all gone in an instant. Was Ethan Miller a victim of emotional breakdown, or did he simply destroy his own life and his family's future through his own blind rage? Ethan couldn't answer that question, and maybe he never would. But as the days passed in his cold, lonely prison cell, the only thing he knew for sure was that he would never escape the consequences of his actions. The cost of betrayal had been more than he had ever have imagined, and it had taken everything he had. The story ended, not with a resolution, but with a haunting question that lingered in the air. What price is too high for revenge? Ethan Miller's legacy would forever be defined by the choices he made and the lives he destroyed in the process. The haunting cost of his blind rage would echo through the years, leaving a trail of destruction that could never be undone. In the end, the story of Ethan Miller serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the destructive power of unchecked emotions. Through betrayal, rage, and the loss of control, Ethan's world, once built on loyalty, justice, and family, crumbled. The price of his actions was steep, a tragedy not only for him, but for everyone involved. His story serves as a cautionary tale. The consequences of betrayal can extend far beyond the moment of betrayal itself, and the emotional toll of losing control can leave scars that last a lifetime. Ethan Miller's legacy, marked by the irreversible damage he inflicted on those he loved most, underscores the devastating impact of blind rage and the fragility of even the strongest relationships. The idea that love, loyalty, and trust can be shattered so completely by a single moment of emotional collapse resonates deeply, reminding us of the importance of controlling our impulses and valuing the connections we hold dear. This is a story about loss. The loss of family, of self-respect, of innocence, and, ultimately, of everything that truly matters. And it asks us to reflect on the choices we make, how they shape not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. And what would you do if everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and justice was shattered? If you found this story gripping, heart-wrenching, and thought-provoking, please consider subscribing for more powerful tales of human emotion, tragedy, and the complexities of life. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories with you. Subscribe now for more captivating stories that explore the deepest corners of the human experience. Researchers call this technology the signaling brain.